Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as we explore the U.S. consumer in the COVID-19 crisis. I'm Lynn Franco, Senior Director of Economic Indicators, and I'll be moderating our session today. Now, among some of the questions that we're going to explore are, what impact has COVID-19 had on the U.S. Consumer, and in particular, consumer confidence? What are the likely growth scenarios for rebooting an economy that's currently in freefall? What industries and consumers have been hardest hit, and what new consumer behaviors can we expect in a post-COVID-19 world? Now, before I introduce my guest today, a little sidebar on those of you here who need to earn CPE credits. First, there will be 3 pop-ups that will come throughout the presentation, and you've got to stay on for the entire presentation. When you see the pop-up, please put in your full name and email address in the space provided. And now on to our guest. Joining me today is Gad Lebanon, Vice President of Labor Markets, and Denise Dalhoff, Senior Researcher at the Consumer Research area. So thank you both. Welcome, Gad. Welcome, Denise.
Thank you.
So let's get to our first question. What's happening in terms of consumer confidence and the U.S. consumer? Last week we put out our consumer confidence report, and we saw a rather sharp decline in consumer confidence. And we took a look at it sort of, as you can see here, to see if it was, how it compared to prior shocks. And we've had a few, and as you can see, some are sort of, one-offs, like, for instance, Hurricane Katrina or a U.S. debt ceiling crisis, where it tends to have a temporary impact on confidence, and we sort of see a return to normal in 1 to 4 months. A few others, such as September, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the Lehman Brothers collapses, either led to a recession or happened during a recession. So while we're still in the very early stages of COVID-19, we really think that this is much more than just a temporary shock. Now, one of the ways in which we measure consumer confidence is we sort of take a look at the present situation, and that sort of takes the pulse on consumers' view of current labor market conditions and current business conditions, and that gives us what we call our present situation index. We also ask consumers their expectations 6 months out regarding business conditions, the labor market, their personal income prospects, and that yields what we call the expectations index. And that's what you see here is there was this very sharp drop-off in consumers' expectations, over 20 points, or actually close to 20 points. That's one of the top 8 declines that we've seen in consumer confidence. Contrary to this, though, however, the present situation held relatively stable, and we think that's really because what we saw was confidence measured sort of in the early part of March, where we hadn't seen that rather large pickup in unemployment claims, which has been close to 10 million over the last 2 weeks. So I think once that sort of filters through into consumer confidence, we're not only going to see a further decline in expectations, but also probably a very dramatic drop in present situation and a very overall sharp in consumer confidence. If we take a look here, sort of narrow in on consumer confidence in particular regions of the U.S. and also in particular states, we can see that the impact has been somewhat different. So for instance, if we take a look at the East, South, Central, we had almost a 32-point decline there. And that really encompasses Louisiana, and in particular New Orleans, which we know is becoming more of a hot spot. At the other extreme end, we have New England, which experienced virtually no decline in consumer expectations. But here, too, we probably expect sharper declines in the coming months. As we know now, Boston is also seeing it's becoming a hot spot as well. So there's some impact, and it's somewhat working its way across the United States. If we take a look, for instance, and narrow in on Illinois, we can see that contrary to some of the other states where we had sharp declines, there was actually an increase here, and we really expect that to erode over the coming month. As we know now, the situation in Chicago is also, taking a turn for the worse, and that's becoming a hot spot as well. So I think this gives us a pretty good look at how we can see the impacts, across the United States, in particular regions and in particular states, and see pretty much that, these sharp declines are likely to get even worse as time goes on. And there's other questions. Yes, Denise?
There is a question from the audience. What was the period of the survey when it was running?
It was running during about the first 2.5 weeks of March. So it was really lockdown, shutdown. So I think it was really the tip of the iceberg in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. And now I think as we begin to see sort of the results come in from the latter half of March and also early April, we're likely to see just another significant deterioration in consumer confidence. And interestingly enough, there's a variety of other questions that we also ask in the survey that don't necessarily go into the index itself, but I think kind of tease up today's conversation. So for instance, we've asked consumers about their expectations for the financial markets over the coming year, and there was a sharp increase in those that expect values to continue to decline, and I think that speaks to the volatility that today we're still seeing in the financial markets. Also, we ask about purchasing intentions for homes and autos and durable goods, and we've seen declines there, which I think are really just going to get magnified over the coming month or two, and really reflect this rather sharp pullback that we've seen in consumer spending, and probably in consumers putting on the shelf any type of big-ticket item purchases over the next coming months as we begin to sort of filter through the economic fallout. So in a nutshell, I think what we see here is that we've got sort of very weak consumer confidence, likely to get much weaker in the coming months, and one that really suggests that we're in a very severe economic contraction. And with that, sort of teeing up, I'll hand it over to Gad, who's going to take us through and a few of the scenarios that we expect in terms of growth, what industries we see that have been hardest hit, and which consumer segments are most likely to be most impacted and slower to rebound in a post-COVID-19 world. Gad?
Sure. Thanks, Lynn. Actually, do we have an audience poll question now first?
Yes, let's go to that. So first of all, to what extent has your business been impacted, or do you expect it to be impacted by COVID-19? And I think this is a good time also to remind everyone to please use the chat box and put in your questions. Would like to make this as conversational as possible. So interestingly, we can close the polls now. We've got about 45% who say it's had a major impact on their business, and another 41% who said it's had a very moderate impact. So Gad, with that, I'll hand it over to you.
I am curious who had no impact. Is it maybe it's the businesses in Antarctica? No, I'm joking. There are probably a few businesses that are not impacted, but there are some businesses who are benefiting from this as well. So, so that's very interesting. Can we go back to the slides? Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, in thinking about the future, I think it would be good to think about the economy. Well, first of all, I think the core of the outlook, what really will impact everything, is what will happen to the consumption categories that are especially affected by social distancing. And perhaps it's useful to think on it in the context of the hammer and the dance, which if you Google hammer and the dance, it's a long post on Medium that went viral, and I think provides a very good explanation of the potential future. So the idea is that the hammer, this is the period where we squish the virus with a hammer, and this is the period of until the initial containment, which is probably a couple of months. That in that period we, of course, now experiencing it. A lot of shutdown orders of non-essential businesses and stay-at-home orders. But the most likely scenario that in a couple of months there will be a significant containment of the virus. In some areas in the US we're already starting to see the curve flattening. And then there will be a longer period, probably a year or two, that is called the dance, and so that's after the hammer ends and until full vaccination. So in that period, it's called the dance because it's kind of a dance between the virus and the authorities, or between the virus and society. The virus will try to spread, and the society will try to contain it. And to some degree, there will be much more opening of the economy after the hammer, but it will not be a full recovery probably as long as the full vaccination is not up and running. I think the idea of the period of this dance is to achieve maximum economic activity and employment without overwhelming the health system. And a lot of it will depend on the transmission rate, R. So if R is above 1, that means that on average everyone who's infected will infect more than one person. If it is below 1, that means that on average every infected person infects less than one person. So if R is above 1, we'll kind of have an exponential increase in the number of infected people. If it's below 1, it will gradually die down. Probably in many places in the world now, it's between 2 and 3. So it's not easy to reduce it to 1, but this is essential to not overwhelm the health system. It could also vary by season, by location, by age. So, for example, there are some hopes that when the weather in the northern hemisphere in the U.S. Gets warmer as we move into the summer, the spreading of the virus will become slower. If you look at the countries in the southern hemisphere and countries that are close to the equator, you see much less spreading and much fewer deaths than you see in Europe and the US, for example. So we hope that, so it could be that during the summer we would need less social distancing to keep R below 1, but maybe then when we move back to the fall and next winter, the virus will spread more easily, and then we will need to tighten the social distancing again. It may also depend on location. So, for example, in New York City, where so many people rely on public transportation, it will be harder to keep R below 1 because people get infected in public transportation. Whereas in rural areas where most is done by driving or walking, it's much easier to contain the spread. And it's also social distancing will depend on age. We probably would expect older Americans who this virus is much more dangerous for them to experience more severe and longer period of social distancing. And I think Lynn is our second audience poll question.
Right. So how confident are you that the impacts from COVID-19 will gradually abate or resolve by Q3?
Just to remind you, Q3 is July, August, September.
Right. So I think that's one scenario that we have, that there'll be a summertime recovery. Another is the fall, and another is sort of a return. And interestingly enough, we've got about 31% saying they're not at all confident. A third actually about slightly confident. So we've got, okay, so it's, I guess overall we're not confident that this will abate by Q3. Only less than 9% are. So I don't know, Gad, if you could talk a little bit to sort of the recovery scenarios that we have as well, right? So I think this falls into the fall to winter recovery stage.
Yeah, I think, you know, if indeed we don't see a significant containment in the summer or in even late spring, I think the impact on the economy is going to be much stronger with a a longer period of a drop in business activity, a much later opening, and I think that would be a very unfortunate scenario, because part of it is that to hope that to have this period of the summer to kind of buy us time to prepare for the potential bounce back in the fall and in the winter, to be better prepared medically, to have better medication, better testing. So it's very important this period that we have the time to prepare for that. So let's hope that we don't get to this situation. If we go back to the slides, so what will happen during to the economy during the dense period? So I think, especially in terms of consumer spending, what will remain open, what will not. So part of it is what the government will decide to shut down. So the government may decide that several kinds of economic or consumption activities will remain closed even after we kind of finish the hammer part or the strong containment. So I know that the NBA season was canceled, and then the Major League Baseball was canceled. So will they decide to cancel also the NFL? That's a big question. So I think those kinds of things may depend on what governments decides to do, but it also depends on consumer fears. So, for example, we are able to use to go on flights now, but many people prefer not to do that, and they may prefer not to do it even 3, 4, 5 months from now. So, so a lot of or a lot of consumer activities, consumers may try to avoid, even if they are allowed to engage in them. So which consumption groups are most likely to be impacted during the dense period? So I think that depends on the risk of being infected. So, you know, how many people consumers get exposed to in each kind of a consumer activity, how crowded the activity is, do they require a flight to get to? So, for example, visiting the Grand Canyon by itself doesn't sound like a very dangerous activity, but if you have to take a flight from New York to the Grand Canyon, then it becomes much more risky. Does it involve people entering your home? So a lot of potential categories are not outside the home, but remodeling or appliance repair or just cleaning your house, things like that, that people may decide to avoid during the spread of the virus. How much is the consumption category dominated by older consumers? So, as we mentioned earlier, older consumers are likely to cut back more on social distancing categories. So some categories like remodeling, like eating breakfast and lunch in full-service restaurants, and many other categories, the share of older consumers is much higher than average. It's also, so it depends on kind of the things related to the risk of being infected, but also by how discretionary are those categories and how, to what degree they can be replaced from home, or in other words, how much this activity can be avoided for a year or two. So for example, you can go clothes shopping in the store, but you can also do it from home. So the fact that you have an alternative that also could impact the degree that the business would be impacted. And we have a related question to that.
Right. We've got, because you've spoken a lot about behaviors, right, sort of putting on temporarily on pause. So we'd like to know how likely our audience thinks that these consumer behaviors may return to normal in a post-COVID-19 world. It's very interesting results that we're seeing here. Okay, I guess we can close the polls. And again, I'll encourage people to put some questions in the chat box for our presenters here. So we've got about 45%, 50% saying it's unlikely or extremely unlikely that we're going to return to sort of, normal after this, with about 48%, 49% saying that perhaps we will. So almost split. So I guess that's encouraging or discouraging news, depending on whether you see the glass half empty or half full. But it could likely very well be that, at least these changes, Gad, from what you pointed out, will be with us at least for another year or two before we have a full opportunity to return to normal.
Yeah, I think also, I don't know how exactly everyone here interpreted the question, but it could be that some things will return to normal immediately after the hammer part. Some may not, but they will return to normal after, let's say, the period of full vaccination. But there may be consumer categories that will not return to normal even after that. That's like a much more permanent changes. Like, for example, one thing that I can think of is that this experience that we're having now will permanently increase the share of office workers that work mostly from home, because we have this experience now, and maybe many employers will decide, that's not so bad, we'll make that permanent. Actually, can we go one slide back? So if more people are working from home, that means that fewer in the office and fewer are eating in around the office or doing shopping around the office. So I wonder if that will create a permanent shift of retail and food services from inner cities or downtowns where a lot of businesses are to where people live in the suburbs or in other outside the city center.
Right. We've got a little input here, Gad. What is normal consumer behavior post-COVID? It's expected we'll do some things differently, and I think you touched upon that, right? That this could be sort of a multi-step, a sort of progression back to where we were before the pandemic, and maybe some of the big events, sporting events. Where it's a lot of people, crowds in tight quarters, maybe one of the last things to sort of return, but a few other luxuries, whether it may be, dining out or going to get a haircut, which I'm looking forward to, might be something that we can do sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
And there can also probably be new normals in many areas, like telemedicine, if you think of that, that might move a little bit more online. And many other behaviors that we're now getting more used to. Of course, not everything will survive, but there will be many new normals probably.
Yeah. And maybe one way to kind of try to summarize it is in this, so I created this speculative diagram where on the kind of moving from left to right, so I kind of ranked 26 consumer categories here. So from left to right are the ones that are from the least infectious to the most infectious, and from down to up, it's to what degree those categories are discretionary or could be replaced from home. So what kind of going through this table, and again, this is, we spend a lot of time thinking about it, but it is not a kind of objective, completely objective measures. It's more a subjective assessment. But So we think that the ones that are in the upper right, so concerts, sports events, movie theaters, casinos, cruises, amusement park, they are on the one hand, they are there's a high risk of being infected in many of those. Either they are crowded, people are exposed to a lot of other people. Some of them, it's a long period of time, so those are high-risk consumer categories that could also are relatively discretionary. Like if you think about all of them, if you had to give them up for a year, let's say, it will reduce your standard of living a little, but it's not essential activities. And some of them, like watching movies, you can watch them from home, and there are good alternatives at home.
Dad, we've got a question.
Yes.
Where in this does air travel fit in?
Yeah, I took like the transportation categories out here, but I would say that they are very much on the more infectious part. In terms of how discretionary they are, that depends on the type. So, for example, traveling to a conference or to a vacation may be more discretionary, but if it's visiting family members or things like that, that's things that maybe people will have to do and risk it, especially younger people. So it depends, but I think a lot of the categories here, a part of it depends on how, if you need a flight to get to. So, for example, in some, like going to a cruise or to Disney World or to the Grand Canyon, a lot of people would have to fly to those things, which makes the risk of contagion higher. I think there are all kinds of other questions here. I did want to make a few other kind of observations that are related to that. So at the moment, when you look at the July jobs report, 60% of all the job losses, in the March job report, 60% of all the job losses came from food and services and drinking places industry. But we probably will see a significant recovery after the orders of shutdown and of non-essential business will be lifted. I think they are probably will make a stronger recovery than the categories at the upper right. Although the recovery in full-service restaurants may be slower because than, for example, fast food ones, because they are more discretionary and they are also more dominated by older consumers. So we may see a slower recovery there. I think there are certain categories that, like, for example, the whole healthcare sector that we thought will be unimpacted by this, but or maybe even benefit. But there are several categories that could see a drop. So, for example, non-essential visits to physicians and dental offices, or maybe even certain operations in hospitals that people can wait with for a while. We may see delays there until things get safer. So we should expect, and we already saw in the March jobs report, that the healthcare sector also lost quite a lot of workers during that period.
Ed, we've got an interesting question here before you go on, and it's why should we sort of be assuming a cessation of these activities? Instead of assuming that Americans will do what Southeast Asians have done, which is, wear masks, wear gloves, and then go about our business with a bottle of Purell by our side. So could it be then that what we expect to see will be modifications that will allow us to resume, I guess, some of these higher risk categories quicker?
Yeah, I don't think it will be a cessation, but I think there will be a new element of fear that some people would avoid those things. So it's not like those businesses in the upper right will remain at zero for the next 2 years, but they probably will not go to 100% either. And there will be somewhere in the middle, and there will be all kinds of activities that will convince people to do that, like for example in restaurants, have more spacing between tables, or limit the number of people that are in a specific area in a specific time. But those activities as well will reduce revenue. So I think those businesses are likely to take a hit. Yeah, a few other observations. There will be like all kinds of major life changes, that like moving to a new home, moving to assisted living or nursery home care facilities, or home remodeling and renovation. So those things, if they can be postponed, maybe people will prefer to postpone them until things are safer. So a lot of those activities that involve high risk of contagion may be pushed to the future when the risk is lower. So those are just some kind of initial thoughts that we have on a lot of, in general, many more categories than, the much talked about industries that are at the upper right here are going to be impacted to some degree or another. But there will be also industries that will benefit from it. So for example, if people take fewer vacations that involve flights, they may take more vacations that involve driving and staying in a hotel in a driving distance. So maybe hotels that mostly rely on consumers from a driving distance, maybe they will see some pickup of those opportunities. So a lot to think about. Hopefully this kind of diagram provides some kind of structure to think about those questions.
Can I just chime in with with just a general comment? Like in the left column, where you have like the things, or actually on the vertical, where you have categories that can move somewhat or most online. I would also just add, in general, that always depends also whether, part of the fun of buying these categories is also going to the store and having the experience, interacting with people. For example, clothes shopping. Of course, there's clothes shopping that people actually prefer to do online because it's so much easier and they have a larger selection at hand. But there's other clothes shopping that you purely do for fun. And of course, you wouldn't move that necessarily online because, of the missing social experience. The same with jewelry shopping. And I could also see that for nail salon, both, you want to have nice nail polish so you can do it at home. But then the other part of that is the experience at the salon. So I would say it's probably in some cases occasion-based, or what the purpose is of the transaction, but I think generally this is a really nice way to sort of categorize the different categories.
Yeah, and thanks, Denise. I think that there's a question here about schools. Mm-hmm. I would definitely put schools on the more contagious part. You have 30 kids in a class. Some of them will follow instructions, some of them less so. I think it's probably a contagious activity, although the closing schools have major implications for families. I think it will be very interesting to see what happens in September when schools have to reopen. Yeah, I don't have inside information on that, but I think that will be a very big question.
A comment here too that it seems that car repair would go down more because if we're more working more from home, we're not driving as much.
Yeah, yeah, I think that is correct. Good comment. So let me just, I have a few more slides that are related to the impact on consumer spending. So in addition to the kind of, I would say, first round effect on the most affected industries that we mentioned so far, there is kind of a second round impact on the household income, because we have so many people that are either laid off or had hours cut or had wages cut, that there will be a significant drop in household income, and that by itself, kind of in the second round, will have an impact on consumption. So I think it's important for consumer spending to understand better what are the characteristics of the people who were impacted and the characteristics of the people who are not impacted. So we know for sure that a big part of or a lot of the people who lost their job are more on the lower end of the income distribution. More than half of the people who are probably will lose their jobs are either in food services or leisure and hospitality or personal care. All of them are earning well below average. So that demographic group is going to probably see a bigger cut to consumer spending than the higher income ones. Partly this will be offset by the government stimulus that is by far the biggest that we ever had in this country, and will be very effective because some of it will be the direct payment to individuals, but I think the bigger part of the government stimulus is the large expansion of the unemployment benefits, both in terms of generosity but also scope, that will to a large degree offset the income lost, but it will not be entirely offsetting. So the impact of the overall decline in household income will have, as I mentioned, second round effects, and that will impact some, especially the industries that are more discretionary and more sensitive to just general recession. So, for example, clothes shopping, even after the lifting of the stay-at-home orders, we may see some softness in clothes shopping, because this is a type of industry that always during a recession sees a drop. Or on the other hand, there are categories that typically are not very cyclical, and even categories that will replace the social distancing category. So, for example, healthcare, even though some of it will be impacted by social distancing, but in general it's a relatively non-cyclical consumption category. And there are, like campers, we heard anecdotal evidence that there has been a very large increase in the share in spending on campers. Maybe part of it is because people are trying to escape the cities, so they need to sleep somewhere, but most likely it's simply an alternative kind of vacation that is not very risky. I think in general there will be alternative. People will not just stop spending, they will just eventually spend on other things. Like another category that we heard a lot about is the increase in wine spending. So if you can't drink in a restaurant, you'll drink twice as much at home. So so there will be other ways video games, toys, things that people will purchase. So eventually the void will be filled by other types of spending.
Gad, does this mean that sort of, I know, some of our forecasts had said we'd have a sharp rebound when it does come because of pent-up demand. But when you take a look at sort of the job losses and income losses, right, that we're experiencing, does that now suggest that sort of rebound will be a little bit more muted?
So it will be a strange kind of rebound. I think for quite a while there will be many businesses that will continue to shed workers, and just because we are in a general recession. But at the same time, when those orders to stay at home and shut essential business, when they will be lifted, you'll see millions of workers going back to work. And I think that probably will offset to a large degree the shedding of additional workers. So it will be a very strange, it's going to be a very strange recession that we may see actually in a couple of months overall employment starting to rise again, because so many people will go back to work in the businesses that are reopening, even though there will still be a lot of layoffs in other types of industries.
Okay, we've got a few more questions. First one is that I guess we've seen the increase of sale of tops in clothes due to everyone working from home. I've seen that as well. It's because, as you can see from the video conferencing, everyone is seen sort of from the waist up. So hence, we're sort of spending more on what's visible. So yes, that's sort of part of the new norm as more people work remotely. We've got another question on what's the impact of this on increased government debt? What's the impact of increased government debt?
The government debt will rise very rapidly, but as opposed to the past, I have to say there is not that much concern about that among most economists, partly because the interest rates are so low that even though government debt is increasing, it will be serviced at a lower interest rate, so the overall kind of annual burden as a share of GDP is not going to be devastatingly higher. And part of it is that even if it has long-term damages, I think a lot of people are in the opinion that we should do it anyhow just to prevent the painful damage at the moment.
Okay, and we've got another question as well, that even after recovery, will job seekers gravitate away from the affected industries for fear of it happening again?
It could be. I think that would be a very interesting question, like specifically about COVID, but also in general about pandemics. If are we in a period now that, some of the diseases that are related to viruses, vaccination is not 100% proof, a foolproof solution, so there will be some fear remaining probably even after there is full vaccination. So and there could be all kinds of new surprises down the road. So it's potentially an option that could happen. That this is not a 1-2 year thing, but a longer change. Are there any other questions?
I think that's it for now.
Yeah. So let me, I know I want to make sure Denise has time to talk. So let me just show you the slides that I'm not going to talk about, and and if the viewers want to download the slides, they can do it later. But there are a few slides on kind of what older Americans are more likely to spend their money on, and because they are likely to cut back more. So there are a few slides on that, and on where do we see most of the population 65 and above. They tend to concentrate in retirement destinations especially, so it's not evenly distributed across the country. Then also from the perspective of areas that are most impacted, the areas that will be most are the ones that rely most on the impacted industries that we mentioned before, but also on oil, because oil prices are now dramatically dropping. So in this map we show the metro areas that are rely the most on the most impacted industry. So you see a combination of vacation destinations and oil destinations. Again, there will be a very large variation in the most impacted areas, and according to our analysis, not surprisingly, Las Vegas is going to be the metro area that is most impacted because they rely so much on vacations. And I think it's time to move on.
Okay. Well, Denise is going to actually take us into the post-COVID world. And one of the areas that we're going to sort of pontificate about is sort of what will be sort of the new small luxuries or the new small indulgences that will emerge. So I think we've seen in the past, as Denise and Gad both alluded to, it's sort of, these little pampering or luxury experiences. So how likely do you think that new small indulgences are going to emerge after COVID-19?
Looks like there's big agreement that we'll have some new categories. There
Absolutely.
We go. So that's the vast majority. You must have all lived through a recession to a crisis to assume this. So let's actually get back to that in a little bit, and maybe you can think about what those categories might be that we'll be seeing as new small luxuries in people's lives.
Okay. I just taught my daughters and my wife how to play poker, so that's an example.
Okay, good. Poker. Can we go back to the slide? Okay, great. So I want to talk a little bit about what consumers might be seeking in this post-crisis world, and also how consumption behaviors and some major consumer categories might be changing. So the first thing that people will be looking for is trust. They want to feel safe in people's establishments, on airplanes and stadiums, wherever they are. That's one of the components. The other one is, this is a time of heightened sensitivity. People have been going through a lot. For many people, this has been a traumatic time. So they really look for any, businesses to, that they can trust. And that entails, for example, we hear a lot these days about price gouging, also data privacy. There's a concern now because it's a crisis time, there's a lot of health tracking. People really are seeking this trust, and that's extremely important to gain customers back and to gain new customers after the crisis. The second thing is comfort. People, in times of stress, people seek the tried and true. They want to, that often involves craving nostalgic experiences, brands that they know and love, maybe holiday destinations that they are familiar with, sales associates that they know that they have a relationship with. All of that provides comfort. That's going to be important as well. Number three is value. There is definitely going to be a new sense of frugality. People will be watching their money, so they will be seeking value, which doesn't necessarily mean like the lowest price, but they want like a good ratio between what they get and what they pay. So value orientation really important. Another thing that people are getting to appreciate more and more probably through their online lives is that online things can be really convenient. For example, you can very easily search online. There's also no checkout line online. You just check out. You don't have to stand in line for 15 or 20 minutes. So the bar will be rising for offline stores once people, live mostly offline again. So that's something to keep in mind. People will also be craving experience and entertainment offline. We know, we do this all online these days and virtually, but it is so important for people to have social interactions in person, and they often go to stores or to salons or to, even to shows and concerts which you can watch online, but the fun is to be there in person. So that will be important as well. And, everybody's talking these days about how they miss all their social relationships and, their groups of friends and family in person. And that also relates to the commercial world. So social relationships, meaning, even going to the gym or being part of a, the tribe of a brand or having a relationship with a store associate, that's so important. And people will be craving that after the crisis is over. And then lastly, sustainability has been such a big topic over the last couple of years, and it has been growing in interest and importance. And now with the crisis, of course, I mentioned the value orientation. People will be watching their money. We have found in separate research that the price premium for sustainable products is a real issue for people to buy sustainable brands. So now there might be a trade-off with people being frugal but also wanting to support sustainability. That might be an even bigger dilemma now after the crisis. Sustainability, however, also has a social component. We have been talking a lot these days about, the working conditions of all the healthcare workers or the grocery store workers or the logistics people. So maybe there is a heightened sensitivity and interest in that as well, in fair labor. So we'll see how that plays out. But overall, it's probably a more challenging time, especially in terms of the environment. And then the second part of this is how consumption behavior might change. So online shopping has gone up a lot for both, actually mostly essentials versus discretionary items. So for essentials, people out of convenience now, they don't want to go to the store, have been shopping their groceries and household staples online. And the big question is, will this change or will this behavior last throughout the crisis? Before the crisis, these categories were only in the single digits maybe as a share of total grocery and total household items. So my thought is that, all the barriers before won't go away after the crisis. The barriers of shopping groceries online include the logistics, receiving your groceries at home, keeping them cool, having them not stolen before you get home. It's also a price issue because often you pay for delivery. Currently, people are happy to do that to protect their health, but will they be willing to do that beyond the crisis? That's the big question. I can definitely see, for some groups that, don't like to go to stores, that are still scared to go to the store, for that to continue, or they become now in the, get the taste of it. But for the majority of people, I would expect them to go back to the store once they can. Also, many people like to be inspired by the store environment. They like to touch and pick their own produce. So we probably will not see this huge spike in online shopping. However, what I can also see is that there will be more ordering online and picking up at the store for convenience reasons and also for health reasons, to not be in the store too long and interact with too many people. Then the next category, this relates to the value orientation. We can probably expect to see the discount and off-price and everyday low-price retailers to be very popular. We have seen that already after the last recession, that these sectors gained a lot, and that is from grocery stores, when you think of Trader Joe's, Aldi, Lidl, but also Walmart, to fashion, like when you think of TJ Maxx, Marshall, the dollar stores. All of those should be really popular. Apparel and fashion, God mentioned this already, clothing in recessions typically goes down. What we might expect here is that there should be a lot of promotions probably after everybody goes back into the world, because currently there is merchandise sitting in the stores that needs to be cleared. So that might be one thing that we'll see. Another trend that in apparel that has been going on for a while now is secondhand stores and rentals. And that's a big question now, because while people are seeking, less expensive clothing options, there's also the issue of hygiene. Will people be wanting to wear used clothing, or will this sway them back to or away from secondhand? So that's the big question. It goes to the operations of a secondhand store. They have to really make sure that people trust them in terms of the health standards, and that people feel comfortable going to those stores.
So Denise, quick question, because it seems that, sort of we were in the midst of seeing, new trends in apparel and in fashion, right? So now it seems that this could very much sort of put an end to those trends, perhaps, or sort of, derail them, or perhaps result in new trends. But it seems that, secondhand clothing and such may really experience quite a bit of pullback in after post-COVID-19.
Yeah, and that's for the health reason. The stores have already started to communicate to their customers that they're really making sure to keep these secondhand and rental clothes very, clean. That's very important. However, there might still be a gap between people feeling comfortable, even wearing those items. So this could be on hold until really there's a vaccine. On the other hand, it has also been more younger people that go to these stores that they might not be quite as afraid of the virus. So, let's see how that's going to play out. But yeah, in general, the fashion sector will probably change a lot. Let me skip to travel, which, is an interesting question. Also there, a recent trend has been to these Airbnbs and other shared accommodations. The question there is now, will the post-COVID crisis world, will that actually see a resurgence in interest in rather staying at hotels, because people might rely more on their cleanliness, their professional cleaning services, versus staying at somebody's house. So that will be interesting to see how that plays out. And the third option, of course, as Scott also mentioned before, the camping and RV world. Will that have a resurgence, because people can drive in their own car, their own tent, they have their own RV, and also it's less expensive. So will that be, a new trend in travel? And I don't know, we are running out of time a little bit, Lynn. Should we jump to our last
Sure.
to our last slide, to the question about little indulgences? Here are just some examples from the last recession. There used to be something like a lipstick index, which was actually the indicator when the economy was not doing that well, that women, bought more lipstick as a little indulgence. However, in the last recession, that actually became nail polish. There was this explosion of new colors, and that became the little luxury in the last recession. Also, the categories that were growing there were food trucks, where often more upscale restaurants even had a food truck. Again, it became like a little treat, but at a reasonable price. And also these off-price stores like Marshall's, TJ Maxx, Nordstrom Rack, as well as, if anybody remembers, flash sale sites like Guild and Rue La La and many others that are largely either not existing anymore or they have changed their business model. And then lastly, the category that really came out of that recession were cupcakes. And as a very simple, treat, easy to make, there were also many local store spaces available. So that was a good, sort of entrepreneurial venture to fill those vacant spots and also make people happier. So that's it in a nutshell. So again, let's see what kinds of little new luxuries this new crisis will bring us.
Well, thanks, Denise, and thanks, guys. And I'd like to thank everybody for participating in today's webcast. I'd also, as you can see over the next couple of slides, just want to alert you to the fact that, this is just one in a series of many webcasts and podcasts that we have discussing the impact of COVID-19. These are just a few of the upcoming webcasts that we have over the next few weeks. You can also visit our hub where we have a variety of material about COVID-19 and its implications, and that's on our Conference Board website. We've also got a series of podcasts as well. So please stay tuned. There's plenty more coming from the Conference Board. And for those of you whose questions we didn't get to during this webcast, we will reach out to you afterwards. But again, thank you all very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And if it's